All right, we did it. Credits. All right, good game. All right, let's talk about it. First things first, though. The bottom center of the screen says that we've beaten 124 games in 2023 and 446 since we started doing this in 2020. Those numbers are now outdated. We have now beaten 125 games in 2023, and this will be our last game of the year. And 447 since we started doing this in 2020. Okay. Wow. Good game. Good game. Let's talk about it. I cannot help but compare this game to Superliminal. It's not derivative of Superliminal, but it's clearly inspired by that game. Like, specifically that game. It's also clearly inspired by games like Portal, just like Superliminal was. But the forced perspective part, it really has a Superliminal feel to it. So that's good and bad. It's good because that's a great game to inspire you, and anything that's anything like that game is going to be good. But it's also bad news because that is a very tough comparison to make. You compare yourself to a game that good, it's going to be hard to look good yourself. So I've been kind of hard on this game because I've been thinking like, well, is this better or worse than Superliminal? And that's a high bar. But let's talk about the positives. It takes that formula, complete the level, move on, complete the level, move on kind of thing, that started with Portal, and it introduces a way to do, a way to solve puzzles, a way to interact with that world in a way that is unique. It's different. It's a different thing from Superliminal. It's a different thing from Portal. And it is very cool and very satisfying. The whole take a picture and paste the picture into reality is something that is pretty cool. And it's not hard to basically understand the basic rules of how something like that works to start out with. It gets a little crazier later and a little bit more confusing. We'll get to that in a second. But the basic idea works very well and is very cool. The story of the game, it's got an interesting, without spoiling it, the ending was kind of cool, but I don't think I love the story. So let's wait to talk about that until we talk about the negatives. The difficulty was at times very challenging, but not very often. So maybe we gotta talk about that in negatives too. It's funny because the idea and the execution of the idea is so cool that even if I have 4 or 5 negative things to say about this game, like, overall I did really like the game because the idea is very cool and the puzzles are very fun to solve, right? I'm struggling a little bit here. Let's go ahead and talk about some negative things. It's not hard enough until the end. It gets more difficult right close to the end in the last couple of chapters. There's a couple of puzzles that are really tough. And some of them are for the right reasons. Like, they're just really good brain benders and they introduce some new mechanic that makes things trickier. And I enjoyed that. That was probably my favorite part, was toward the end of the game where the puzzles started to get harder. But most of the game is pretty easy. The first 75% of the game is pretty easy. And then when it does start to turn up the heat on the difficulty, it doesn't really explain some of the rules. You kind of have to experiment to figure it out on your own, which is okay, except that when you're exploring solutions on your own, you would hope that the answers are intuitive. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Of course it would work that way. Whereas there were a couple of times it's like, okay, oh, that's what it does? Okay, that doesn't make any sense, but at least I know what the rule is now, and then you move on knowing that. There were a couple of times where I thought the rules weren't very intuitive. And then so it does this balancing act between being too easy and being hard for the wrong reasons. Although there were some exceptions, especially close to the end, where it was like, this is tough, and then when I figure out the solution, it's like, oh, the game gave me the tools that I need to come to that solution myself, and it just took me a while to get there. That's really satisfying, but when it's like, oh, I have to do it that way? Why? I don't really understand. Okay, well, whatever. Now I know that from now on. There was a couple of those moments, and that's not as satisfying. So yeah. The difficulty was kind of weird. It was either too easy or wrong or hard for unsatisfying reasons. Most of the time. It was one of those two things. Mostly it was too easy. A little bit it was too hard for the wrong reason. Or not too hard, but hard for the wrong reasons. And then a little bit toward the end it was hard for the right reasons. So the difficulty was a little weird. I think maybe the part of the problem is that the actual concept isn't a vehicle for as much as you would like, as you could think of for like Portal or Superliminal. Like Portal, obviously they have mods for days, and people have figured out all kinds of ways to make new puzzles with interesting angles with that basic concept. Superliminal, I always felt like you could do the same thing. Like, there may be mods for Superliminal out there that have found ways to make new puzzles use the same formula. I feel like this formula got pretty much exhausted. I feel like there's not much else you could do, and this is a short game, and it's shorter than both of those other games, and I don't think you could make it much longer. It'd be hard, I think, to make a mod for this game that's like, hey, I've made Viewfinder 2 unofficial with all these new elements that take the game in a new direction. Like, if you're gonna do that, you'd have to come up with some really weird stuff that isn't as organic. And actually, I feel like the game itself did that toward the end. Introduced some new mechanics that didn't really have anything to do with the core concept, but they needed something else because the Viewfinder concept, wow, very cool, you can only do so much with it. That's how it felt to me. The story was interesting to a degree. It's this very, like, eco-conscious, like, climate change thing, and I like the message, of course. I think it's an important message, but it felt tacked on. Felt a little shoehorned in. It felt like they were like, all right, let's make a game about taking this photograph mechanic, whatever. And then, but what are we going to make the theme of it? I feel like they could have done a better job of finding a theme that really ties into the idea of taking pictures of reality, making them stills, moving them around, manipulating them. Like, there are some themes in there that I can see. But they were like, climate change is important, let's just make it about climate change. Like, it kind of felt like that for me. Like, what does that really have to do with taking pictures? What's the tie-in there? Why is it about climate change? It just felt... and I wouldn't consider that a spoiler because you find that out immediately when you start playing the game. I think it's even in the trailers. I didn't think that the story tied in that well to the mechanics of the game. It's just like, oh, it's also about climate change. Okay, fine. But I never really understood how the science of what these people were working on had really anything to do with climate change. Or what parts that were about climate change had anything to do with taking pictures. or any of that, the actual mechanics of the game. So I don't know. I didn't love that. I thought games, if you look at a game like Portal, or really even Superliminal, even better, that game ties it up so perfectly, and it's like, oh, all the stuff that I've been doing all this time is really about this. And it makes, once it's revealed to you, and I won't say what it is because that game's, it's not evident at first. Once you realize what the game is really about, it's like, oh shit, that makes perfect sense. And it's beautiful. And it's probably the thing I like the very best about that game, even over the puzzle solving, is that once you realize what the game is really about and what you're really doing, it is a beautiful point that the game makes. This game just never got there. And I think the reason is that they just like, well, I feel, the developers of the game were like, we feel really strongly about climate change, and I think we should make it about that. Even though it doesn't, on the surface, really make sense. We can try and find a way to make it make sense, but it never really does. So, I never got that payoff at the end. There's a little moment at the end that's very cool, but I never got that payoff at the end like you get with Superliminal. It's like, oh shit. Oh, now I understand what this whole thing is about. That never really happened with this game. What else? So we've talked about the difficulty and how some of the puzzles don't really make a lot of sense. The mechanic doesn't have a lot of runway. Story didn't really jive with the rest of what was going on. I think that's mostly it as far as like critiques. But even though I have a lot more negative to say about this game than positive, overall, the core puzzle solving mechanic was satisfying enough that it outweighed all of that and made for a very satisfying game. Definitely worth the time and the money to play this. I would absolutely recommend it to people that liked Portal and liked Superliminal. But I would make it very clear that while the puzzle solving is solid and is there, just like it is in those games, you're not going to get the overall satisfaction that you get with those other games. Because Portal is not just about solving puzzles, right? It's also about the humor of the game and where it's taking you, and the meta aspects of it that you get toward the end, especially in the first one. And then the second one, it's a lot about the characters and about the humor and about the history. So there's a lot of else going on in Portal 2. This game's more like Portal 1. But this game just didn't have that payoff like those other games did. So, but I did really like it. And when I think about other puzzle-solving games that I played recently, like Cocoon, I think I liked it close to as much maybe as Cocoon. Cocoon's still better because it's everything in that story, in that game, really makes sense and comes together and just clicks together just right. This game just doesn't really do that. But it's still fun. It's still really fun, and it is worth playing. So, I've played other puzzle games that aren't as good. I'm trying to think of some right now, but they're not as good, so they're not as memorable, so it's not coming to my mind. But when I go back and look at my list of games that were puzzle games that I ranked lower, this probably won't be the lowest one. Most of these games I like a lot, but just and this one's no exception. It's just not as pristine as those other games, And this, again, I recognize that's a very high bar. Portal 2 and Superliminal are both amazing games, so yeah. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great game. Well put together. The physics and the way that this game is technically put together, it must have been very difficult to make work, The physics of it are really impressive. So I think that's worth noting. It's just from a technical aspect, developing a game like this seems very ambitious. And they nailed it. They 98% nailed it as far as how the physics actually work in the game. So that's what was really the most satisfying, was just being able to manipulate the world and understanding the framework of the world, and being able to operate inside of that pretty seamlessly. That was satisfying. So, all right, we did it. Viewfinder, it's been fun. But we are now going to delete you from our console and never play you again. Bye! See ya. See ya later.